We're entering now a story as we begin the fourth week of Easter, a story that becomes a game changer for Christianity. And this simple story leads to a great separation between two types of Christians. And this is the story of all of a sudden, Peter comes to realize that there is no such thing as unclean animals. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you have to understand this within the concept of Judaism. In Judaism, there are certain animals you can eat, and there's certain animals that you can't. And they're considered, the ones that you can are considered unclean. For example, pork. Now, how it's defined as unclean, it just means God forbids them. Now, ironically enough, if you really think about it, pork is one of those foods, and pork is a food that has to be cooked well. You can have what is known as steak tartare, which is basically, I know I'd get that word out, basically raw steak, which, by the way, is the way I love it and always loved it until I worked with cowboys. As you know, I used to be a chaplain for bull riders, and they said, of course, they know cows and bulls and everything else, and they said, no, never do that. So it's my favorite way of eating steak, but they said no. As a matter of fact, I guess in Canada, it's called blue, but I don't know if it's legal in Canada. It's not legal in many states, including New York. I think it's legal in Massachusetts, but I haven't eaten it that way since the cowboys in Brazil said no. So anyway, pork has to be cooked well. You can't have a pork tartare because it's really dangerous. You get what is known as trichinosis, which is caused by parasites that live in pork, in pigs. So, but there are certain animals. I had it's kind of a funny story. A cousin of mine used to export or basically ship lobsters. So they were involved in selling and shipping lobsters. And the company was based in Canada. However, he ran the office locally, and it was all lobster. He'd be shipping lobsters all over the world. Well, they advertised in a newspaper, and they didn't seem to get any responses from the advertising. And finally, he asked the boss, and what's the name of the newspaper? And it was a Jewish newspaper. And he said, Jews do not eat lobster. They consider it unclean, at least as I understood at the time. So it's interesting. There are certain foods they could eat and there's certain food they can eat and certain foods they can't. Well, at this particular moment in Christianity, which is the very beginning, Peter, the Holy Spirit speaks to Peter and says, that ends. There is no longer any difference between unclean and clean animals. All animals are now called clean. So, and this is an important development because this, by the way, is specifically the reason why you can have bacon and eggs and your Jewish neighbor cannot, because the Jewish neighbor cannot eat bacon. Now, I have a priest friend of mine who lived with me in Alston, and out of deference to the Muslims from his country, he is Nigerian. Muslims don't eat pork either. Out of deference to the Muslims, he never ate pork, so he didn't know anything. I don't know, might have had it sometime in his life, but he didn't know about pork. So I eat pork a lot just because I maintain my weight. I'm very careful about my weight. And pork actually seems to have, you can eat more for less calories than even chicken, from what I found. Maybe I'm wrong, but you know how bad my math is. But in any case, so I eat pork a lot, and he had never had it. And I told him, I said, he didn't want having it, but I'm cooking it. And I said, pork is one food, you have to cook really well. And he's like, really? And I said, absolutely. In fact, I know that when I eat pork, when I'm first cooking it, I always check the temperature. And you should not eat any pork that comes out. Well, you shouldn't eat any pork that really comes out less than 150 degrees. And really, to some degree, the higher the better. Obviously, you get it super high and forget it. But nothing below 140 degrees. And really, you shouldn't be down there to begin with. And that's important. I explained that to him. And that means every part of pork, by the way, not just, oh, well, it's 140 degrees here, which you shouldn't do anyway. So I'm not even encouraging you to do that. But it's only 130 at another part of the pork. Well, that's not a good thing, because the parasite that causes trichinosis dies at 137. So as you see, you want to get that to a decent. You don't want to cook all the flavor out of pork. You don't want to turn it into something you could also use to repair your shoes. But at the same time, you definitely don't want to have it to such a point that it becomes dangerous. So this is an important distinction. Well, yeah, Father, I came up to learn about the Bible and I get a cooking show. What's going on here? So in any case, so that's important. Well, now all food is declared clean. And there's no such thing as an unclean food. Well, I want you to think that one through, because we're going to see this pop up again. I want you to think that one through. This is the beginning of what I call the manifestation, the prophecy coming true. Why? Because remember, we start to realize that the apostles are starting to reach out to the Gentiles. And eventually they'll become, with Paul and Barnabas, that'll be a mission to the Gentiles. Well, the Gentiles don't have a concept of unclean food. The Greeks didn't have a concept of unclean food, at least not to the same level that the Jews did. And this is the beginning of spreading the message, which ultimately becomes Christianity throughout all the world. So this is a real important moment in the history of our faith, is this moment that all food is declared clean. And again, it's one of those moments that you can read and go, okay, all food is declared clean. Okay, well, that's nice. And so anyway, no, this is huge, because this is the beginning of the change. I always like to bring up, I know I bring it up maybe even too much, the time that Sony invented the flat screen TV, and I was in the Navy at the time. Of course, now we have a word for the TVs that those of us who are older grew up with, and that is box TV. People would say to me, recently, well, I'm looking for a box TV. I go, what is a box TV? And then they explained to me, I said, oh, we call that a TV. But now that's what people call a box TV made with a cathode ray tube, in case you didn't know the name of the tube for a TV tube, cathode ray tube. It's a box TV. Well, back then, there was no such thing as a flat screen TV. The closest thing you could get is a screen that would take a projection onto it of TV, but there was no such thing as a flat screen TV. So I know you've heard the story before. When I was at muster, for anyone who hasn't heard the story, when I was at muster one morning in the Navy, they said, hey, Sony just invented a flat screen TV, and everyone's getting all kinds of excited. Wow, that's so cool. Wow. And I looked at them, and I said, well, I can understand. That's kind of an interesting adventure, but why are you so excited about this? And they said, did you ever see Dick Tracy? And Dick Tracy had the Dick Tracy watch, which had a little TV screen on. It was a cartoon. It's still around. Dick Tracy watch. And they said, you can do that now. And now, in fact, something we didn't think of when we were watching Dick Tracy is everyone would have a Dick Tracy watch. How many people walk around with flat screen watches? That was impossible prior to Sony inventing the flat screen TV. So you can see that, but they're all excited. And I'm like, look, I can understand it's a pretty cool invention, but why are you so excited about that? And that's what they were so excited about. Well, it's the same thing. All food is clean. You can, wow, isn't that exciting? And you might say, well, I can understand that's kind of interesting. Makes cooking a lot easier and shopping a lot easier, but I don't see the excitement. Don't you understand? This is the beginning of the message being, the prophecy coming true, that all the world will come to worship the God of the Jews in Jerusalem. This is the beginning. And you'd reckon, wow, this is so powerful now. You understand. And it's this particular story that begins it. We're going to see a few more elements of it over the Acts of the Apostles, but this is a powerful story that lets us know that this is the beginning of the move to bring everything to the Gentiles. Now, you never know. They may have been the opposite. Oh, well, now they're going to open it up to the Gentiles. We don't want that. No. And that could have been actually some thought. It's not in the Acts of the Apostles, but, thinking human the way it is, that could actually have been it. You could have had both ideas. In any case, this is this powerful story. We're going to talk more on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast, and we are here every single Monday through Friday. And you can subscribe, you can like, you can comment, please do, and let people know about the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. We'll be right back right after this. Did you know that the Catholic Audio Media Podcast is available on various podcast platforms? You can find us, among others, on Podbean, which is our home platform. You can find it on Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeart, among others. Just look for Catholic Audio Media, all one word. On some platforms, such as Spotify, look for Catholic Audio Media, 3 words, and subscribe and listen to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon, patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media, patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer, previews of upcoming podcasts, previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com, your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out, patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. We're back. And I happen to, I'm very much into music and very much into all kinds of music and everything else. My favorite music is jazz, but I was at one time hoping someday to become a rock and roll disc jockey. You can see how well that worked. But in any case, and so I am fascinated, as you know, about these reaction videos. And I happened to see a couple reaction videos where, and there's one in particular, and it's from a channel called Mr. Video. And so the channel address, I guess, would be youtube.com/@MrVideo123. I realize, at MrVideo123. And if you look at the name of the video, it's Mr. Period space video, but at Mr. Video 123. So anyway, he is a black young adult, and he sees for the first time Mr. Bojangles by Sammy Davis Jr. And he is blown away by it. Now, I don't know if you know how these reaction videos work, but if you notice, if you watch these reaction videos, they stop somewhere in the video and they'll make a comment. Well, they're required by YouTube to do that. And he, at the end of this video, he is blown away. And he says, I even forgot to stop. He was so blown away by Sammy Davis Jr.'s performance of Mr. Bojangles. Now, he had mentioned, and I looked it up as well. Mr. Bojangles is originally was written by a man by the name of Jerry Jeff Walker, and he plays it on guitar, and you see it, and it's a nice tune. But I grew up with the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band version, and then of course we also knew the Sammy Davis Jr. version. But what's fascinating about this is he really didn't know. I don't think he knew anything about Sammy Davis Jr. And looking back in those days, we can go, Sammy. Well, we knew Sammy Davis Jr. When he was even on. He was even on All in the Family. We knew Sammy Davis Jr. We knew of him, but growing up at that time, we didn't necessarily realize all the controversy behind the scenes. For example, watching Star Trek, there's the famous story of that famous whole section between William Shatner and we'll go Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura. I don't know if I pronounced her name right. I'm sorry, but you know who I mean. And the two of them together, and I don't know whether they were dancing together or something like that. And we'd watch this, and we'd see, oh yeah, well, isn't that a little bit? And I think they were forced to do that by one of the characters who on one of the planets they visited, and say, oh, isn't that something? Da da da. No, that was a groundbreaking scene because never before was a black person and a white person, I think, dancing together. It never before, because back then there was this great separation between the black community and the white community per order of the producers of TV. It was crazy, absolutely crazy. We look back at that and go, that's crazy. Well, Sammy Davis Jr., interesting, he was a member of the Rat Pack, and that is Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop. And and I'm looking it up and found out that there were several over the years and previous to this that were known as the Rat Pack. But this is, when you say the Rat Pack, that's who you're thinking of. And of course, Sammy Davis was one of them. Well, Sammy Davis was not allowed to stay at some of the hotels where he performed because he was black. And Frank Sinatra stepped in and said, no, we're not going to tolerate this. I mean, that was the craziness of the time. Now, there was a rumor out, and turns out it is not true. Sammy Davis had a glass eye because, this is not a rumor, this is true, because he got into a car accident, and the car he was driving was it was one of the Ford Motor Company products. It had this steering wheel design that was basically an accident waiting to happen. And he went into the steering wheel, and the way it was designed, I think it had like a sharp corner or something like that on a steering wheel. Yes, I know. It wasn't a wheel. It was more, I think it would have been more like an airplane control, because back then they were into airplanes and cars and stuff. Cars that look like airplanes, which even though they couldn't take off, but that's the way it is. If you go back, you look at some of the long fins they have and stuff, that's all part of that. So that actually destroyed his eye, and that's why he wore a glass eye. There was a rumor out, and turns out it is not true, that he was delayed in treatment and lost his eye that way because he was black. That turned out not to be true. That is a rumor out there. It's not true. But he was treated differently and negatively because he was black. So as I'm watching this reaction video, and he is blown away by the performance of Sammy Davis Jr. And Sammy and Mr. Bojangles, as you know, he had his signature song, Sammy Davis Jr. I Gotta Be Me. He had some great tunes, but he loved the song Mr. Bojangles. And if you don't know about Sammy Davis Jr., he grew up dancing, literally. He was performing at like 3 years old, and he had been performing all his life. And he knew the subject of Mr. Bojangles, which was the dancer Bill Robinson. So, long story short, there you go. There's this whole long story. But he was so excited by it, and he was so blown away that he forgot to stop the video. right? Because he said this performance was incredible. And of course, this is a reaction video. He could always redo it and stop it in between, but it wouldn't be a reaction to his first viewing. And he was fascinated by it. And as I'm looking at that and looking at just how powerful that story was, I'm realizing just the importance of this whole history of understanding not only these great performers, but unfortunately, the history behind it. Do you know that Ella Fitzgerald, one of the greatest singers, of course, black, and she was bumped from a flight by Pan Am in Honolulu when she was on her way to Australia, and she had to miss the early part of the tour because Ella Fitzgerald was black, and therefore she was bumped because someone needed to be on a flight. And that's absolutely, today, of course, people would raise protests and everything would turn into this major protest and all the other stuff. But back then, that was considered normal. And it's so bizarre. We look at it, but this was part of our history that we had that. And then you look at such a great entertainer like Sammy Davis Jr., who obviously pulled in lots of money for the people, for the hotels where he performed, couldn't even stay at the hotel where he performed because he was black. Crazy stuff. That is sin, by the way. That's part of the sin of racism. That would be sinful to do that. And so fascinating story, but also fascinating to see people discover these performers, and also for us to look and understand the history that they experienced during that time. We're going to be back on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast.
No word in the English language is less convincing than probably.
Are you sure we should get matching tattoos on our first date?
Sure. We'll probably stay together.
Probably? It's been 23 minutes since I ate. I can probably swim.
You should wait 30 minutes.
Okay, now tell me what to do. Cannonball! Cramp! Oh, I have a cramp.
I can probably hit the green from here.
Probably.
Can I get a mulligan?
Ready to go?
Hey, are you sure you're okay to drive?
Yeah, I'm pretty sober. Yeah, I'm probably okay.
Probably okay isn't okay, especially when it comes to drinking and driving. If you're drinking, call a cab, a car, or a friend. Buzzed driving is drunk driving. A message brought to you by NHTSA and the Ad Council.
Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts. Previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com. Your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out, patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. We're back. Well, tomorrow we're going to be focused again on Paul. We're going to be focused on some of the spreading of the faith. And remember what I said today, isn't that fascinating? That the faith is spread starting today. The faith is spread because of, or it opens the door to it because of the change of diet, the dietary laws. Isn't that fascinating? So, and the Jews and the Muslims still hold fast, the Orthodox Jews still are it's kind of like the Christians. Well, which ones are we talking about? Well, there are various varieties. And same thing with the Jews, the various types of Jews, but generally those who follow the dietary laws from Judaism will follow those laws today. But in Christianity, we don't have to, all because of the scene we saw today, and we're going to see the spread of the faith. We're going to be back tomorrow. Have yourself a blessed day, and we will see you then.
Yeah. You know the real is back. Father Carr Chaplain from the city of champions, dropping daily reflections coming straight from the field. The raw truth revealed for the strong-willed. It's the Greatest Act of Defiance podcast with your host Father Carr, a message built to last. The Greatest Act of Defiance podcast. That's right, the Greatest Act of Defiance. Word up. Word up. Word up. Word up.
The Catholic teaching in this podcast is reflected and presented as accurately as possible. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Archdiocese of Boston or any other institution.